Good evening. As I preached this morning's lesson, it kind of drew my mind back to a book that I've read several times, and goes back to that lectureship I went to. And the man that spoke at that lectureship, he told me, he said, "You need to read a book." He said, "The book you need to read is When a Nation Forgets God by Erwin Lutzer." Erwin Lutzer was no longer as active in the pulpit, but he preached at the Moody Church in Chicago, which is a pretty famous place if you ever studied D.L. Moody and that group. For several years, 22 years, he's wrote about 70 books, but he wrote a book called When the Nation Forgets God. It's 7 lessons we must learn from Nazi Germany. And I did read that book, and I've read that book several times since then, because I think that it has a powerful messages in it about ways that Hitler did what Hitler did, and you know, the way he accomplished those things. Hitler was a smart guy. He was a guy that took a government that was floundering in inflation, people that were starving to death and literally had no food on their table. He revitalized their economy. He gave them pride in their nation. He revitalized their industry. He brought a nation that really got, if you know history, a nation who really got pummeled after World War I, who really got everything taken away from them. He revitalized that nation. Matter of fact, there was a time, and I think I had that quote in this lesson somewhere, there was a time when Winston Churchill of Great Britain praised Hitler as one of the greatest minds of the century, praised him as somebody who revitalized things. The German people, they loved him. They wanted to follow him. He didn't make them do it. They saw him almost as a savior of their nation. He did things. He had Hitler's youth. He allowed people to take vacations that had never in their life taken vacations. He took the youth to camps that were sponsored by the government, and he indoctrinated them into his philosophy and his idea, and he really did a lot of these things. And I think we think of Hitler, we don't think of those things, obviously. We think of all the atrocities he committed and the terrible things that he did. But the truth is that's not how it started. He started by putting those people behind him and by making that nation be on his side. So you kind of got to understand, Hitler did some things that were pretty astounding. But in this book, he talks about several things. When God is separated from government, judgment follows. It's always the economy. That which is legal might also be evil. Propaganda can change a nation. Parents, not the state, are responsible for a child's training. Ordinary heroes can make a difference. We must exalt the cross and the gathering darkness. And a lot of those things, I think, are things that are kind of eternal, things that governments do over and over, that people do over. How did he do it? How did he exterminate 6 million people? How did he get away with that? Well, he dehumanized a lot of the population. He made them evil. He made people want to be against him. As I said this morning, he took groups and ethnic groups and segments of population, and he basically alienated people against those groups and said those groups need to be annihilated for whatever reason. We'll talk about that a little bit this evening. He empowered people who supported him, and he intimidated and with laws and stripped power from those who did not support him. And a lot of those people that we'll talk about through this series, a lot of those people that he intimidated, a lot of those people that he stripped power through were people who stood on God's side. They were people that were influential in the church. He needed to control the church. Hitler understood that. He needed to control the church. He needed to control what was stated from pulpits. He needed to make that happen, and he did a really good job of that. Hitler was really good about supporting people who supported him, and he was really good about intimidating and taking care of people who simply did not support him, and he did that throughout his reign. He gained the trust of the German people by sweeping economic and social reformation, and we'll talk about that. He did tremendous things with the economy, and people supported him because, plain and simple, people had food in their belly and, a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage, right? I mean, he made that happen. You know, Adolf said, if you confine yourself to the church, he had a meeting of church people, and he called them into his, whatever it was, of these leaders of the church from all these different denominations and segments. And one of my favorite people was in that meeting, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I love him. I'm going to bring him up. He's one of my heroes, you know, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was one of the guys in that group. And he brought him into this room, into this group, and he basically said, you confine yourself to the church and let me take care of the German people. You know, I'm not against, Hitler would basically say, I'm not against the church, I'm not against God, I'm not against any of that, as long as it doesn't interfere with me. You know, as long as you keep it out of my mess, keep it out of my face, I'm 100% good with it. But don't challenge what I do. Don't challenge, and when they did, they paid a really heavy price for that, and that's something I think that's really interesting historically, and some tremendous quotes and tremendous writings came out of that. You know, but I think what Hitler wanted is he wanted the power to be in the government. He wanted the government to play God, right? The government played God. You know, the government became what people looked towards, and Hitler wanted that. And one interesting thing that came out of that lectureship with that guy that was in Hitler's youth, that's one thing he really said. He said, you know, Hitler wanted us to know that every good thing we had came from the government. We had these camps, we had these vacations, the money, all these things that we had, they all came from the government. They didn't come from God, they didn't come from anything else. And the government was responsible for it, and Hitler wanted to have their allegiance to the government. And we do that a lot in our society today and in our world today. And I think more and more I see that in the United States, is that we're more and more government's the God. You know, government's our God. And we look towards that, and we've taken the church, we've taken our God, we've taken the church off of Main Street to the side street. We've taken away the church's influence. And the government's largely done that. And I think that's something that we have to kind of look at as Christians. You know, he put these groups of people and basically said these groups of people don't deserve to live, you know. They were, and you know, we often think of the Holocaust, and we hear that, and we think of the Jews, and 6 million Jews were killed, and they're definitely the largest segment of people that were killed by Hitler. But what you got to understand is that there were a lot of groups that Hitler deemed needed to be exterminated, needed to be cleansed basically from this Aryan race, this perfect society. The Jews were a lot of people, 6 million, right? But the Slavic people, the Poles, the Russians, Belisarians, Ukrainians, Serbs, you know, the Roma, the Gypsies were definitely targeted. A lot of them were killed in concentration camps. Soviet prisoners of war, POWs, mentally and physically disabled. That was part of the T4 program, and if you really want to understand that, I would say Google it. Hitler's T4. They call it the T4 because the building it was in, the street started with a T, and it was building 4, and it was called the T4 program. And over 250,000 people were exterminated through the T4 program, and those were people who were the elderly, people who were mentally and physically disabled. And it started with children. Interestingly, Hitler sent out a thing to clinics, to doctors early on as part of a research. Wanted to know children that had epilepsy, that had mental retardation, that had physical disabilities. And eventually he took that list of people and he said, send your children, went to the parents and said, send your children to these facilities where we're going to try to rehabilitate them. We're going to try to fix what's wrong with them. But basically all they did there was they murdered all those children. And eventually that caught on, but it's part of the T4 program. And he eventually spread that to elderly people and to people with mental disabilities. Political dissidents. He was really good at quieting people that were against him. He killed them off. Homosexuals were targeted, especially male homosexuals. Witnesses would refuse to swear allegiance, so Jehovah's Witnesses, some Roman Catholics, Freemasons, people of color, including Afro-Germans, anti-partisan victims. So, you know, we often look at the Holocaust, we think Hitler was just after the Jews. Simply not true. Hitler wanted to cleanse society from a lot of different things, and he wanted the government to play God in order to make that happen. In our Declaration of Independence, it says, all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Sometimes we forget that. You know, when our founding fathers started this nation, they didn't say that our rights came from the government. They said that our rights came from our Creator. It doesn't say God, because a lot of people who signed the Declaration of Independence were not Christian. They were deists. They believe in a higher being or a higher authority, but a lot of them were deists. They weren't necessarily Christian. They weren't Protestant. They weren't Catholic. A lot of them were simply deists. And so in the Declaration of Independence, it says they're endowed by our Creator, which to you and me is God. And that essentially was what it was to them, but that's the reason it doesn't say God in the Declaration of Independence. It says they were endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We're the only country in the world who says that our rights don't come from the government, our rights come from God. It's a really big thing to me, and it should be a really big thing to you. And it's something that I think we forget. Our rights in our Declaration of Independence, our rights don't stem from the government. Our rights stem from God, and we're all entitled to those rights. It's interesting that was written while we still had slaves, isn't it? In a time when slaves still existed, and some of these men who wrote this and signed this owned slaves themselves. But even in that, they signed this Declaration of Independence that said we all have inalienable rights from our Creator. But it's interesting, at that time, they didn't deem that slaves were worthy of those rights. It's interesting how we place ourselves in that position, isn't it, in life? You know, the truth is we do the same thing. We dehumanize segments of the population, and one of the biggest segments of population that we dehumanize is unborn children. You know, it's interesting, we don't say baby, do we? You know, you never hear that word. We never say that. We say what? We say things like fetus, or unborn, or gestation. We say words that don't say baby, don't we? You know, the truth is, and what hurts me, I think, more than anything in our world is abortion. I love our babies so much. And you know, we live in a world where there's no reason for a woman that doesn't desire to get pregnant to become pregnant. There's plenty of ways for that not to happen, and yet abortion in this nation continues to increase. And it's funny how the media and propaganda tells us that we have to have that because of risk to the mother and because of rape and because of incest. But if you look at statistics, less than 1.5% of abortions have anything to do with danger to the mother, rape, or incest. Almost all abortions are simply because they don't want to have a child, they don't want the responsibility, they don't want to fit into their life. It's personal reasons, and that's statistically true if you want to look at that. The truth is that in 2024, there were 1.14 million abortions in the United States. That's inconceivable to me. And either that we can do that we can make that decision for a child that's not born. And most states have no limit on the age of abortion. Do you know that? There's no limit on the term. And babies are aborted a lot of times that are 24 to 28 weeks old. Do you know that a 24-week-old baby that's in a prenatal unit, that 2/3 of those babies survive into adulthood? You know, at that point, we're talking about children, we're talking about viable fetuses, that could be children, that could be adults. We do this in this country. Almost 53% of abortion in this country is by drugs now and by telehealth. They don't even go to a clinic or go to a physician. They're simply prescribed a drug over a phone by a doctor, and they take that drug and it terminates their pregnancy. Easy, clean, and nobody gets hurt, right? You know, these are things that happens within our world, within our society today. You know, the psalmist tells it in the Psalm 139. It says, "For you formed my inward parts, you wove me in my mother's womb. I will give thanks to you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, and my soul knows it very well." You know, for you and I as Christians, we believe that life starts at conception and that life exists within the womb. I don't have the theological knowledge, and I don't have anywhere to show you when a soul enters the body of a child. I don't have that information. I'm sorry, I don't. It doesn't exist in my world. I don't know when that is. But to me, life begins when life begins. And I think that's the best way I know to say it. Life begins when life begins. And you know, it's funny, I think we live in a world where we're more concerned about animals that get abused and things like that sometimes than we are about children and about babies and about abortion and about children that will never be born into this world. And I think that that's something that you and I as Christians should be appalled at, this very staggering figure of the number of human beings that we put to death every year in this country alone, not to speak of other countries, other nations. You know, when life ends, you know, that's the other end of the spectrum, and it's something that we see in our congregation. It's something that we're seeing throughout the world. You know, we have a large elderly population, and I'm the end of the baby boomers. I was born in 1964. I'm the last of the baby boom population. And, you know, all of us baby boomers, we're reaching that age, right? And there's more of us than probably any segment of the population. And we're all reaching that age, and I know we deal with it in our congregation all the time. People who struggle with debilitating disease at the end, with memory issues and other things that we have to deal with in the best way that we can. We've all seen people with cancer. We've all seen people at the last stages of life. We've probably all had to deal with that. Our teens are gone. I think all of us are in here old enough that we've probably had to deal with those things within our life. You know, we're making that decision too, aren't we? You know, euthanized, legal euthanasia, what we call voluntary euthanasia, is something that exists in our country, exists in a lot of other countries. There's a lot of safeguards in place that deal with this. You have to make that decision when you're of sound mind. You have to make it at least 6 weeks before it happens. You can look it up and read the rules. You have to live in a state where it's allowed if you choose to do that. And some people move to states to make that happen. I don't know the right or wrong. I don't know the theological implications of this. I really don't. I've looked at it. I've studied it. I have my own opinions. I'm sure you do too. What scares me with this is what we saw with Hitler. What scares me is, when do we take away that safeguard? When does the government decide how long we live, when we die, how we die? You know, I think it's something eventually we'll see in our society. I think it's something that's almost inevitable. When does the government begin to play God? When do they decide who's worthy and who's not worthy, and who's productive and who's not productive, and at what point do we draw that line? And like I said, I don't have theological answers for this. I'm simply posing some questions, things I think we'll face in our society, in our lifetime. The sanctity of life. And you and I as Christians, we believe that all life is holy, all life is given by God, all life is sanctified by God, and life is precious and wonderful and something that we should preserve it to all of our ability. We see value, I see value in every person until God decides to take them home. But I think these are things that become a real thing. In Luke 12, it says, all life is created and all life is precious. God says, not 5 sparrows sold for 2 cents, yet not one of them is forgotten before God. Indeed, the very hairs of your head, the scripture says, are all numbered. Do not fear, you are more valuable than many sparrows. You know, I think in our country today, we've come to a place that we no longer honor our elderly. We no longer respect and admire those in our country who are elderly and maybe nursing home. You know, there's 1.4 million people in the United States today that are in nursing homes or some sort of facility. 1.4 million. And that number is going to grow. That number is going to continue to grow throughout our lifetime, what's remaining of our lifetime. You know, we have to understand the sanctity of life. Jesus told us, God told us, honor your father and mother. Isn't that what he said? Honor your father and mother, that your days may be long upon the earth. You know, throughout most societies, the elderly are revered and respected, and their wisdom is looked upon as something that's a treasure, something to be valued. But if you noticed in our society, more and more, we fail to value our elders. We fail to value the wisdom and the knowledge. We fail to give our elderly people the respect that they deserve. Honor, the Bible says, honor your mother and father. It doesn't say just to take care of them. It doesn't say just to make sure that they got everything they need. The Bible says we're to honor our elderly people, honor our fathers and mothers in this world. The government, I think, over time, I think you're going to see more and more how we're moving away from that very principle within our nation. Legal does not equal moral. You know, I don't know how else to say that. I know it's interesting in the Bible, and I'm not going to get deep into this, but there's passages in the Bible that tell us we're to honor our government, we're to respect our laws, and I agree with that, and I think as Christians we're to do that. Peter says in 1 Peter 2, he says, submit yourself to the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king or as one in authority, or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and praise of those who do right. For such is the will of God, that by doing right you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. And I think that's true. I think we should honor our government. We should do what's right. We should not be disruptors. We should not do things against our nation, and I would never propose that we would ever do that. But I also believe that legal does not always equal moral. I believe that. Just because something's legal, it doesn't make it right. Just because something's legal, it's not something that we should be comfortable with. It's not something that we should necessarily support. You got to remember, the same person who wrote 1 Peter 2 also wrote Acts 5:29, where he says we must obey God rather than men. You know, Peter understood there was a point in time when God's law supersedes the laws of man, where God's law is something that we need to adhere to and not necessarily man's law. We can't let the government be our God. God is our God. We're citizens of the kingdom of heaven, as I said today. And our moral stance, where we stand as individuals morally and ethically with God, is something that has to come first within our lives. And I think whenever we quit being those type of people, at that point, we've become non-effectual in the kingdom of God. I want to try to expound upon that just a little bit. I want to share with you a story, and I want to ask you, what would you have done? I lived in Germany during the Nazi Holocaust. I consider myself a Christian. We heard stories of what was happening to the Jews, but we tried to distance ourselves from it because what could anyone do to stop it? A railroad track ran behind our small church, and each Sunday morning we could hear the whistle in the distance and then the wheels coming over the tracks. We became disturbed when we heard the cries coming from the train as it passed by, and we realized that it was carrying Jews like cattle in the cars. Week after week, the whistle would blow. We dreaded to hear the sound of those wheels because we knew that we would hear the cries of the Jews en route to death camp. Their screams tormented us. We knew the time the train was coming. When we heard the whistle blow, we would begin singing hymns, and by the time the train came past our church, we were singing at the top of our voices. If we heard the screams, we sang more loudly, and soon we heard no more. Years passed, and no one talks about it anymore, but I still hear that train whistle in my sleep. God forgive me, forgive all of us who call ourselves Christians yet did nothing to intervene. You know, the truth of it is bad things happen because good people fail to act. You know, and I think as Christians, we have a moral and an ethical responsibility to stand for what we believe. And whenever I preach this sermon, people always say, Rex, what can we do? How can we stop it? How can we stop 1.4 million abortions in the United States? How can we change our society? And my answer to you is we can't. Plain and simple. I can't. You can't. We're not going to stop it. We're never going to do it. So you say, well, Rex, what's the point of this sermon? Because maybe you can stop one. You know? I mean, the truth is we have young people here every Sunday, teenagers. Do we teach them? Do we, in plain and certain terms, do we teach them about life and about what can happen? Do we teach them about being a teenager that's pregnant? Do we teach them about sexual relations and about what can happen and about how that can change their life? Are we honest with them? Do we teach them about what God expects within relationships? You know, I grew up as a Christian child, and I grew up sitting in church my whole life, and nobody in a church ever sat down and told me anything about sex. Never. You know, shame on us, right? Shame on us. You know, I can't change the world. I can't change 1 point. The government's never going to listen to me. They've never asked my opinion. They never will. I could tell you to go vote, but honestly, I don't really think it makes a difference. I'm just being honest. I just don't think it makes that much of a difference. I mean, I'm all about it. I go vote. I'm all about voting. I'm all about exercising your right, but I'm going to be 100% honest. The one vote that Rex has cast has never made a difference in this world ever. Never. Right? But you know where I can make a difference? I can make a difference here. I can make a difference with our teenagers, with our children. Right? I can make a difference and write your legislature, write your representative. You know, I don't know that does a lot of good, but hey, do it. You know, at least you think you're doing something. Pray about it. Put it before God. Talk to people that's in the realm of your circle that you can help. Because, you know, if we can save one child, if we can save one life, then haven't we done a tremendous service to God? You know, if we can just save one. You know, I can't change this world. I can't change this town. Can't. But if I can change one of our children, if I can help one of our children to make the right decision and choose the right mate and live the right life, and then I've won, right? So when I preach this and I teach this lesson, because I'm going to do 7 of these, 6 more. So when I teach these lessons, when we think about this and we look at this other governments and we look at how they fail and we look at how our government fails, because make no mistake, it does, how it fails us and how it fails our faith and how it fails our morals, because it does. And you look at me and you say, Rex, you're just preaching in the wind, you know. You can't change it. Like I say, I'm not trying to change this world. I know I can't. But if we can just change 1 or 2 people, you know, if we can just change some people that sit with us every Sunday, if we can just make these kids have a better life and the right life, then we win. But we're never going to do that if we never talk, if we never influence them, if we never make that effort. We're never going to change anything. So I guess what I could say is things are only going to get worse, I think. It's always kind of how it is, right? But I think that you and I as Christians, as people of God, I think we have the possibility, the responsibility to try to influence at least those people that we can reach, right? At least those people that we can reach. Because we're only going to change this thing one human being at a time, one Christian at a time. So anyway, thanks for your time. I know it's kind of a depressing lesson. I understand that. It kind of depresses me. But I think it's things that we need to, we can't just not listen to the train, you know? At some point, you can't just not listen to the train. At some point, you got to try to derail it, you know? I think. So thanks for your time this evening. I hope you enjoyed this. If we can help you, let it be known.